Good morning and welcome to Wheeling Park High School. I'm a little what they call like teacher tired because this was our first full week of school in a while. So I feel like after all of that, my voice is kind of slipping on me a little bit. So I'll try to hang in there. But yes, welcome to Wheeling Park High School. And let me grab my clicker over here so I can change the slide. Because I'm actually going to start out with just a little brief advertisement, and I wanted to talk about something that we do at Wheeling Park High School. And we sponsor a trip to Washington, D.C. Every single year, and we are doing a Saris fundraiser sale for that. So if anyone is interested in contributing to that fundraiser with some Easter candy, you guys are more than welcome to check out the order forms there. Email me, and you can also buy online so we can send out that information out to you. But this is a fundraiser not only for this trip that we sponsor every year, but also just for field trips within our social studies department in general. So if you have any questions about that, just let me know. And the topic today is what we call the underside of Wheeling history. And a lot of you are familiar with organized crime, gambling, characters such as, Bill Elias and Paul Hankish, and I know some of you probably have memories of maybe some of the establishments that may have been associated with some of that activity. My job here, my goal today is to sort of paint a picture of what very early Wheeling was like and how it revolved around what we called sort of like the sporting life. But when I say sporting life, I'm not talking about athletics here, okay? We're talking about drinking, smoking, gambling, and prostitution, okay? We're major centers here in West Virginia. So I'm gonna set my clicker down here for a second. And what I wanna do to sort of paint that picture is read some excerpts from journals of travelers that passed through Wheeling and what they observed. Because when you want to learn about an area truly, it's best to talk about people that are not from there, people that are passing through, because they're going to be a little bit more honest with their observations. One person I'm going to talk about is Thomas Ashe, and he is well known for writing about his travels throughout America, and he stopped in Wheeling in 1806. And he will say, "To this part of the frontier, all persons outlawed or escaping from justice flee, and they reside here without apprehension of punishment." Okay? So imagine where we're living right now. This wasn't originally a place where outlaws, okay, thieves, people coming to escape justice would have came, because this was the edge of the frontier. Okay? You could hide out here probably pretty safely. Also, a lot of the occupations that would be done in this area cater to men, and we'll talk about that too. So when he arrives in 1806, he also goes on to say, "Yesterday there were two fellows drinking in a public house. The conversation turned to the merit of their horses. A wager was made, and 2/3 of the population followed." So these two guys strike up a bet, and the whole town wants to go observe this horse race. He says the town appeared to be a desert. Stores were shut down. I asked a proprietor why the stores did not remain open. And he told me that all good was done for the day, and that the people would remain on the ground till night, and many would stay until the following morning. The storekeeper went on to say that these things happen 2 or 3 times per week. Ashe would go on to explain that the excitement did in fact carry on into the evening, where people drank, played cards, and both men and women danced, okay? So 1806. So not only is Wheeling gaining this reputation for a wide open town, also the morals here are a little loose. Men and women are dancing together in public, all right? Another writer would say, about 10 or 15 years later, "Among the lustiest consumers of alcohol were stage drivers, lumberjacks, riverboatmen, and canal builders. Men engaged in these occupations shared one common trait. They were members of a new mobile class without customs, roots, or social ties. They were restless, rootless men who led lonely and unstructured lives. They had no way of joining together to help one another. They had no group identity, no social identity. They were nowhere men. So again, like another illustration of the people that were attracted to Wheeling, and I love that term, nowhere men, all right? Like take a second and imagine like what that man might have looked like. And for me, I imagine one of those riverboatmen. You know, they've been on the river maybe for a couple weeks working hard, or that lumberjack that's been out in the wilderness on the edge of the frontier here, working hard, very isolated job, mostly around men. It's been a while maybe since he's seen a woman, and he comes into Wheeling and it has anything that you could imagine. And he's got a little money in his pocket. And so again, the gambling, the drinking, the women, all of that comes into play here. But again, that's the type of population that was here, mostly men, unattached men, and you could argue, you know, maybe their morals were, they were lacking in that department. Now, I want you to think, okay, 2025. What part of Ohio County today caters to what you might refer to as nowhere men? What area of Ohio County caters to the travelers? Dallas Pike, the truck stop, okay? Now, I don't want to make the stereotype that all truck drivers are participating in adult activity, but think about it, okay? There's a reason that that's located there off Interstate 70. It's on sort of like the outskirts, and that's why at Dallas Pike you have places like, say, Jill's Gentlemen's Club, okay? There's a reason that that's located there. It's catering to a particular population. Wheeling really is no different. It's catering to those men that were there. And I mean, think about it. There's a reason that, you know, all that adult entertainment is located there and not, say, like next door to Ogilvy or something like that. Think about another establishment, Godfather's, okay? What is that located near? Racetrack, gambling, women, all of this culturally all kind of goes together, all right? So again, kind of like, you know, when you think about and try to like marinate your head with what early Wheeling was like, it revolves around these types of men. And it's kind of funny because, you know, I live near Dallas Pike, and anytime I mention like, oh yeah, you know, I live near Dallas Pike, it almost never fails. They say, oh, do you live near Jill's? No, I mean, it's there, but that's what people for a long time associated that with. And I don't know, that just always struck me as funny. 1832, another observer says, the gentry of Ohio County indulge freely in the sport of horse racing. There is a 4-mile course at the lower end of town. Early on the morning of races, almost the entire population of the town might be seen there. And the 4-mile course that this gentleman was talking about would be south of Wheeling Creek, where, you know, Center Market, where Ritchietown, where South Wheeling is today. There was a major racetrack there where a lot of this gambling took place. So I'm going to flip pages here because I got my hands full. And you guys know, if you've been with me from the beginning, I always bring in an artifact. And my artifact today is I knew I needed a clipboard. And so I pulled out one from the Weimer Meatpacking Company. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have memories of that. So we're going to fast forward to the 1840s here. Now this man was very descriptive of Wheeling. And he talks about how he stayed at something called the United States Hotel. And he says that his room was pleasant and the fare was good. But he said the people that frequent the taverns are there not only to have a drink, but they're there for the fling of the dice. So horse racing, table games, dice, other forms of gambling that were going on here. He then goes on to describe a scene from about where Wheeling Park is today, where he watched an endless parade of traffic that included stagecoaches, freight haulers, in drovers with dust on their whiskers, all ready to taste the pleasures of Wheeling's brothels, okay? So the National Road will help bring in a lot of men, a lot of travelers, a lot of nowhere men, a lot of people that are unattached, and they're passing through Wheeling for all sorts of various purposes. So again, the National Road brings a lot of this activity in. He also goes on to say that every inn, every rooming house, every first-class tavern is jammed, and the billiard balls roll constantly. So men are also playing pool in these establishments. He says the glasses clank and the alcohol flows with the smoke from cigars. So, I mean, you know, I can almost imagine the scene that he's describing when you were to walk in one of these taverns. This might be one of his best quotes from this particular journal. He also says there are flashy girls who purse two red lips together and their saucy eyes smiled hospitality that demanded cash. So again, someone from Wheeling may not really say that, but an outsider, very observant. Hospitality that demanded cash. So a lot of different trades are being practiced here in Wheeling, a lot of different occupations, but prostitution would be a big one. He mentioned that crossing the street in Wheeling was very difficult, and one time he was almost run down by a drunken man. He'll go on to say, as he was leaving a livery stable one evening, he witnessed a woman in a bright red shawl leading a drunken man up an outside stairwell. So again, I mean, this is not something that was hidden. It was very visible as to what was going on in Wheeling. Lastly, he goes on to say, after a long day, I went to bed. I could still hear the clatter of glassware and the clink of bottles, and I swore the street noises grew louder as the night grew older. He says, I slept, but not before I latched my door and wedged a stout chair under the knob. So, I mean, this guy's almost a little nervous of, what's going to happen to me here in Wheeling with all of this activity. It is just one big party. And that was in the 1840s. So the one thing that would rise in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s would be the saloon culture of Wheeling. So in 1876, there were 63 saloons in downtown Wheeling. 63, 1876. So, I always tell my students, they're like, what's downtown Wheeling? What are the borders for that? Because it seems like to them Wheeling is everywhere. And I tell them, imagine, the Fulton area where the Mingo Indian is to down the South Wheeling. That's basically what we're referring to. 63 saloons. 1914, there are at least 126 saloons. So imagine every corner that you're going around, there's a saloon, there's a sign, it's advertising beer, whiskey, and not too far away from those locations, it's probably a house of ill repute, okay, or a house of prostitution, or one of those brothels. And I mean, they were kind of located everywhere, but one of your big areas would be Water Street, and it's no mistake. You have men coming in off the river, you have men coming in off the National Road. It's a perfect location for that sort of activity. And what I'll do is I'll show you some pictures here. And what do those saloons look like, all right? Whoops. We're not moving here. Let's see. See if we can connect. And I'm used to this classroom stuff happening, fixing stuff. This doesn't bother me. It worked earlier, right? Well, that's okay. So these saloons were very small, okay? Basically, they had a bar where you could stand and drink, and then what else did they offer maybe in the back that was free? Gambling. Food, yeah. Salty food. So when I was searching through old newspapers, like one of the big specialties that they would do was turtle soup, okay? But yeah, like a free lunch meat, make a sandwich, things along those lines, and a lot of salty food to keep the guys there drinking and gambling. But they weren't much. They were very small establishments, a bar to drink and, socialize. And also, this is where a lot of men would learn what was going on in Wheeling, all right? This is where, maybe different languages were spoken, and that's how you got all your information, was in these saloons, all right? All right, I guess we're not going to work there, but that's okay. So, I wanted to find a couple stories for you so you get an idea of what saloon life was like. Now, I had this headline on the board, but I'll just read it to you. The headline of this news story was, "Drank himself to death on a wager." Now this is Benwood, but close enough, just outside of Wheeling. We'll see if you can get it working. Fine. If not, no big deal. I think they're triple. So, a resident of Benwood dropped dead as a result of drinking too much liquor in order to win a wager with a fellow countryman at the First and Last Chance Saloon of that city. Okay, these guys will bet on anything, all right? So here was the bet. He was to drink 5 beers and the same number of whiskeys, and he won, okay? But the problem is that he passed out after all that, all right? And let's see if we can get you. Oh, there we go. So, yeah, that's basically what a typical saloon would have looked like. Nothing fancy, okay? Thank you, Mr. Markle. So, yeah, nothing fancy. This one looks like it's maybe decorated for New Year's or something. And then here's that headline. So, yeah, this guy passed out after he won the bet, and I guess people thought, well, he just needs to sleep it off a little bit, and he'll be all right. A couple hours later, they check on him, he died, okay? And I thought, okay, well, 5 beers and 5 whiskeys, I mean, what's going on here? That's a lot, okay, but, what's going on here? And it goes on to say the man was a foreigner, and he was employed at the Benwood Mills, and he was married and had a family, but this gives you a glimpse of what Wheeling was like. Turns out this guy was drinking all day, okay? He was spotted in Bel Air that morning at another saloon, drinking for the entire day, crosses the river, goes to what was the name of this? The First and Last Chance Saloon to end the night, makes this wager, and he dies. So, I mean, again, like these guys were living a very, very rough life, and it's also, I mean, ultimately a sad story. This guy left behind a family, all right? But yeah, I mean, drinking, gambling could be fatal. Another story, and that one was in 1905. Let's see here. This headline's also great. So again, these are from the Wheeling newspapers. Hacked to pieces with a big knife. A foreigner living in the North End, whose name could not be learned, was hacked to pieces with a big knife in the handle of one of his countrymen in a saloon brawl about 6 o'clock last evening. He is now lying in the North Wheeling Hospital in serious condition and may not recover. Well, they would end up arresting 3 guys for this, and there was another guy they were still looking for that lived in Fulton. They hadn't found him yet, but a warrant was out for his arrest. But the article goes on to say it was impossible to learn the particulars of the fight as none of the participants speak English in a way to be understood. So this also gives you an idea of what Wheeling was like, all right? You could have walked down the street and, again, heard multiple languages being spoken, and it's hard to learn information about what actually happened here. Wheeling would be this melting pot of immigrants. And another thing is, as you read these articles, you start to gain an understanding of why maybe the temperance movement had a lot of support, okay? And why people did want to ban the sale of alcohol is you had all sorts of things like this happening throughout Wheeling. Lives were being ruined, families were being split up. It really was having a negative impact. And again, I can see where people would have gotten behind the temperance movement. And this was from 1907. Now, when I found this, I also left the article on the right-hand side there too, because I thought this was funny. Public schools will open today, okay? So guy is, hacked to pieces with a big knife, and we have schools opening too. So I just thought, this is just a strange time that people were living in, all right? So then we're gonna fast forward a little bit to this character, all right? Now, a lot of you guys are familiar with Bill Lias, and he would get his start with bootlegging and then move into illegal racketeering and gambling. And again, if you guys have been with me from the beginning, you guys know that I do in my class these wheeling warm-ups where, you know, I just give like sort of like a fact of the day. And this would be an example of one of those where I talk about this 1400 block here of Market Street, and I talk about Zeller's Steakhouse. So kids don't believe me when I talk about the nightlife of Wheeling and really like how wide open it was, and that people came from all over to experience this lifestyle in Wheeling, that college kids came from Morgantown to Wheeling to party. And people were coming from Pittsburgh and other towns because, again, it was so wide open. And so when I talk about Zeller's Steakhouse, I mentioned that, and this is, again, they just don't believe me, but this is a matchbook cover from Zeller's Steakhouse and the Owl's Grill. But I explained to them they had 3 nightly shows, okay? 8:15, 11:15, and 1 a.m. in the morning, okay? You could go and see a nightly show. And this was something that was happening in establishments all throughout Wheeling. I mean, to me, it doesn't sound like it ever really shut down. But I explained to them, you know, this particular block right here, you know, even though it's changed over the years, it kind of gives you a glimpse of what that underside of Wheeling was like, with the adult videos and the Sportsman's Club. And even though they don't know that that's Zeller's Steakhouse, when you explain that to them, that little snapshot of those buildings, it kind of gives them an idea of this type of activity went on for blocks and blocks and blocks. So again, one of the other things that I do is I try to use those artifacts to teach the history of Wheeling. And this is one of those things that I've uncovered, is I found these pamphlets one day, and it says William G. Lias Day, okay? And this one says 4th anniversary. The one on the other side, I have the back of the pamphlet showing, but it looks like he signed it, okay? So he owned and operated Wheeling Downs, and they had Bill Lias Day. I mean, this guy is basically a criminal, but we're celebrating him with this special day. So I show that to them to kind of explain, even though he was a leader of organized crime, you know, not everyone really looked at him maybe in that regard. Another thing that I use to sort of teach about illegal racketeering and what it is, because kids don't really understand it, and I'm learning myself, is something else that I've uncovered is these, what they call collection reports. And both of these were collected by, I believe his name was George Mannis, and if I'm wrong or mispronouncing that or something, someone definitely let me know. But I was told that basically he was like one of the guys of Bill Lias's crew. And his job was to go around to all the different establishments where Bill Lias had illegal machines. In this case, it looks like they were pinball machines. But his job was to go to those machines and collect the money and have a detailed report and then give the payment to whoever, most likely, eventually Bill Lias. But what's fascinating about these collection reports is that, I know it's probably hard to see from like where you're sitting and everything, but you can start to see that like there was a place called the Bluebird Beer Garden in Elm Grove. That was one of the places where they had these illegal machines. One of them was the bus terminal, okay? So it gives you an idea of like Bill Lias with organized crime. He had his hand in all these different establishments. Some of them, it sounds like he owned, and then some of them, you know, maybe he just was working with someone or maybe pressing someone a little bit to have machines in there. But there was, I believe it was pronounced Seibert's in Elm Grove, which some of you may be familiar with the name. The Old Alpha is mentioned on there. There's the Pirates Cove, which I believe, again, was one of Bill Lias's establishments. And again, like this is for me, like I'm still kind of learning about all this stuff, but to me, this unlocks a lot of history as to where, you know, Bill Lias had, you know, his illegal racketeering. What's also fascinating is on this one, December 9th, 1940, this guy collected $543, okay, in 1940. In today's money, that's about $12,000, okay, that this guy collected from these machines. And again, one of the other things that I like to, again, like use is these artifacts. This is a thermometer advertising the Bluebird Beer Garden, Elm Grove. And then, I don't know much about this, so again, I'm hoping that maybe someone here will be able to shed some light on it, but this is a letterhead from Lias Service. And so I imagine that Bill Lias had a lot of different establishments that he was probably laundering money through, or businesses that were meant to be legitimate, but again, were fronts for illegal activity. And then a lot of other things that I've found is from the Market Street Club on that 1400 block, which again, it's an ashtray and has that horse on it though for the symbol of horse racing. There's Billy's Restaurant and Bar. Now they're really hard to see probably from where you're at, but there's a lighter there for Zeller's Steakhouse, and then Nicky Miller's Pirate Cafe. And then at the top there, it's a penknife, but it's in the shape of a baseball bat, and it's from the Sportsman's Bar, also on the 1400 block of Market Street. And then these were just, like wooden nickels that you would get one of these and a free beer from different establishments in Wheeling. But as I uncover a lot of this stuff and I find it, I'm still learning on like, what does all this mean? Where were these places? And trying to collect memories that people have from these establishments that, in a lot of cases, again, revolve around illegal gambling and a lot of illegal activity. And so this is where I'm going to turn it over to Steve Novotny, all right? Steve Novotny has been a big supporter of what I do with the history of Wheeling, and he's a big supporter of just Wheeling history in general. And he's going to talk to you a little bit about his work. Give Steve a hand.
Got to put a couple things on first.
Yeah, you can put that anywhere.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Steve.
Hi, guys. My name's Steve Novotny. I'm a local writer, local journalist. I'm also on the radio every day, so Monday through Friday, every afternoon. That's why I'm not going to talk a whole long time, because you probably hear enough of me. But yeah, I am currently almost to the end of my second series about organized crime in the city of Wheeling and surrounding areas. A lot of what Ryan has shown you today, is some of the mementos, some of the souvenirs from what a lot of people believe is the best time in Wheeling, West Virginia. I wrote one mob series back in 2015 and 16 for a digital media site called Wheelunk. We started Wheelunk back in 2014. It is now operated by Wheeling Heritage, and they're continuing to do a terrific job. I started a new digital media site back in 2019 called Lead News, L-E-D-E News. We do a lot of community stuff, of course. Karen Butime with the schools, she writes a lot of terrific features on the kids, on the facilities. I mean, look at this place, this is great. But one early June day, I was a judge down at the Wheeling Feeling Chili Cook-Off. And I ran into Bill Calabash. Now, I know that Superintendent Dr. Kim Miller told you a little bit about Bill. He got hired by James Companion, just an icon in town who recently passed away. He got hired by the U.S. Attorney's Office. He was an assistant. And almost immediately, the concentration was organized crime. And Bill first went to one, well, they brought you your money. If you lost, they kept your money, right? Even $500 and some $100 that the collectors got every night, they did that. But Wheeling was wide open, and a lot of people want to believe, and I do, that when you grew up in Wheeling, when I grew up in Wheeling, and I'm almost 60 now, that was the best era of Wheeling. And people want to say, hey, was it because of the mob? And I'm telling you, during all my research and all the comments and everything that I received, people still love Bill Lias. You saw, Ryan showed it, William Lias Day. Okay, he hijacked trucks. Okay, and he was talking about the brothels. There were 24 of them. in Center Wheeling and South Wheeling alone. And it was interesting, a lot of those properties, once Bill Wyeth passed away in 1970, automatically almost kind of went to Paul Hankish. Now, the series I'm writing right now is about the children of Wheeling's mob era. The first one was just the Wheeling mob, the crime, the records, what went on here, the racketeering, the gambling, the prostitution, the murder. It all happened here. People, some don't want to remember the bad things. They want to remember the free colored TVs. And they want to remember the free turkeys that Big Bill used to give out. They want to remember when a husband would go into a bar of Hankish's, spend his entire paycheck trying to even up, that Hankish, it would give back to Paul Hankish, and Hankish would send an envelope of money back with the wife and tell the husband never to come again. Because people who owed had to pay. And if they didn't pay what they owed, they still paid. This series that I'm writing right now, a 12-year-old, not 12 now, 72-year-old young lady lived 3 doors away from the house, from the street in Warwood where Paul Hankish's car blew up back in 1964. I had some of the members of Harry Ham's family. Who remembers Harry Ham? The legendary executive editor of the Wheeling newspapers. His sons remember when Bill Wyeth sent some people to send a message. I talked to a retired tow truck driver that remembered all the partying in downtown Wheeling. We talked to the executive chef of Ernie's Esquire about the environment there and how Tom Burgoyne, the late great Tom Burgoyne, and Bill Calabash would sit on one side of the dining room table and the mob would be on the other. One would send a drink, the other would send the drink back, and the wink-winks in between were very real. I've written about, Bill and his daughter. One day, one night, Bill's working on this thing, and it was a 4-year investigation on the Hankish organization. And when the indictments came down, they were all printed in the newspaper, October 3rd, 1989. His daughter, Sherry Ann, a terrific attorney up in the Pittsburgh area now, wondered why in the world Dad was whispering to so many people. And every once in a while there'd be a file at home. Bill will tell you he didn't work at home, but sometimes he did when he was traveling to another part of the state. The U.S. Attorney's Office covers more than 20 counties in West Virginia in the Northern District. Bill and his bride Rita went to bed. Sherry got up and read all his files. Read about the murder, about the mayhem in Wheeling back then. That's when she started to understand. And the most recent chapter is about the daughter learning about what Daddy did. I wanted this new series, The Children of the Wheeling Mob Era, to be more about the culture of Wheeling that some of you probably remember, that I remember. I remember the Tin Pan Alley having 3 different kinds of music on each floor, okay? I remember the people in the bathroom standing backwards in the stall. Like if somebody's in a bathroom and they're using a stall, you'd see the front of the feet, right? These people were like this because they were using the back of the toilets for what? For the cocaine. Okay, the drugs were here, the booze was here. Ryan, he does a terrific job on the brewery history of the Wheeling area. But what I did, again, and I'm writing about that culture, when people used to deliver envelopes in places like the 12th Street Grill, okay, and the Sportsman, all the billiards places. Pirates Cove was a pretty popular place, and it just happened to be next to 2244 Water Street, a 12-room brothel where most of the men, nowhere men, right, nobody local, that's where they usually went. The culture was real, and it really determined how we lived in a lot of ways. And it was accepted, it was open, some of it. Some wasn't so open. But we accepted it as a society here in Wheeling. And I get asked a lot, ladies and gentlemen, whether the mob made Wheeling a better place. What do you feel? Folks, what do you think? Was Wheeling, West Virginia a better place when the mob was in control? Some people say yes. I say no. I say the mob thrived back then because Wheeling still had a vibrant economy. We still had the steel mills. We still had some glass. We still had toys down in Glendale. Who knew their big boy was made in Glendale, West Virginia? Or not their big boy, their big wheel, sorry. Food, you know. Elby's. God, who doesn't miss that? Right. But it was about the culture. The series ends soon on Lead News. Again, it's only digital. There will be a book coming out. And what I'm going to do is I'm partnering with WeLunk. I'm going to have the first mob series and the second mob series. It's going to go into all one volume. I'm going to self-publish it so I don't have to do everything that Bill's doing. And we're going to donate that money to a charity. Okay? But all that's going to come out, and it's really about how we used to live with organized crime here in Wheeling. And it's not, what's the word? It's not a soft series. We tell the truth, and it's a lot of fun because it's our history. It's part of what we are and what we do. I was contacted by a member of the Hankish family recently. Asked me if I got paid for every time I typed the name Hankish. Said the family is trying to rebound from the horrors that were caused by organized crime in Wheeling. And I let her know, I said, you know, I wonder how the Capones feel. But I told her the impact on Wheeling and how it impacted a lot of people here, not always positively. So chapter 10 does publish tomorrow, and then there will be an epilogue, and then the second mob series that I've written will be over. It'll be finished. And then we'll start working on something else. But what Bill has done, what he has released on Tuesday, is while I wrote about the culture, he wrote about how he took down the mob, not just in Wheeling, but up in Hancock County, down in Marion and Mon counties, the Gallo gang down in the Morgantown area. Okay, how organized crime wasn't just on the strip in Hancock County near Waterford Park, but also how it came from Steubenville, Ohio, and how the Wheeling mob extended from Wheeling all the way down to New Martinsville, all the way to Steubenville, East Liverpool, into Hancock County, along the East Coast. If Paul Hankish was Italian, he would have been a made man. He'd have been a member of the Gambino family, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard about that. But it was a mob, and there's a difference between the mafia and the mob. Anybody know the difference? Well, the mob is just a bang of street hoods, and the mafia is a bunch of street hoods who are family. Only difference. So again, Justice Never Rests came out on Tuesday. Of course, Bill has some books here. I know that he's been signing a lot, and I hope you have the opportunity to meet Bill. So thank you for listening to me babble a little bit, but let's get Bill up here, okay? Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bill Calabash. Oh, yeah. Hold on. Got to get you the other tech here, boss.
I guess we're having some problems with technology today.
Sorry about that, Karen. There you go, bro.
Well, Ryan and Steve is kind of a tough act to follow, but I want to welcome everybody here. And I'm glad we have an opportunity to provide some of the factual backgrounds of the history of Wheeling, and particularly in the Paul Hankey's situation and case. First of all, how did I get here with Justice Never Rests? I just want to give you a little background. I had a lot of people come up, and of course, a lot of the cases that we did in the U.S. Attorney's Office, Hankey's case in particular here, and the other cases in the other area of the district, had a lot of media coverage, and I got a lot of contact from people and saying, why don't you write a book? And Tom Burgoyne, the late Tom Burgoyne, and I talked about it many times, and we really never got around to it. We got off to a start a couple times, but never developed into anything. Now, it's really strange how these things come about. And what connection does an all-state high school football player from Wheeling Central and the Hall of Fame coach Mike Young at Wheeling Central have with Justice Never Rest? Well, it's an interesting story. Curtis McGee was the all-state quarterback at Wheeling Central. I know we're at Wheeling Park here, but at Wheeling Central, and he applied to go to Brown University. And I graduated from Brown University, and Mike called me and said, do you have any contacts at Brown? And because Curtis is coming up there, and I said, yes, I do. And I have a friend, Bill Meckel, who was a fraternity brother. Bill was maintaining a connection with Brown sports and was primarily a lacrosse player, and I played football and lacrosse at Brown. And Bill said, yes, I have some connections there. And say, we have this football player, Curtis, coming up, and we want to make some connections with the coach and also some of the people associated with Brown football. Well, one of those individuals was an individual named John Land, who was also a Brown graduate. John maintained contact with the football team. He was kind of an advisor, and we told him Curtis is coming, can you watch out for him? And they do things like get internships for the players and things of that particular nature. Bill then told John Land, who had written about 60 books on crime, real crime, and things of that category there. And he told Bill, or John, a little bit about my background. And John Land said, well, this is something I might be interested in. And when I left office in 1993, my office put together a booklet called The Trilogy, which listed all the history of our office when I was there and had a summary of all the major cases we prosecuted. And when John Land saw that, he said, this is perfect. We're going to do, we can do this book. And that's how it all started about a year ago. And of course, my daughter then got involved. She was very interested in this. And we started on a case-by-case basis. And the first case in the book is Eric Walton, which is a Wheeling case. And that goes back to the 70s, and when drug activity was just getting started. And Eric had a connection actually with the cartels in Mexico, and they were bringing in marijuana into the Ohio Valley, into other places, Indianapolis, Detroit, places like that. And a DEA agent who was working out of Charleston noticed a bunch of the names were familiar with what was happening here in Wheeling. And we started the investigation, and Eric got indicted. We prosecuted the entire crew, and that was the first association with drugs. There wasn't any connection there with Eric and Paul Hankish and any other organized crime that we were able to find out. And obviously, we weren't looking at that type of activity at that time. So we progressed, and when I became an assistant here, nobody really cooperated with anybody, all the federal agencies and so forth. And there was a lot of information out there. And our first kind of cooperation was in the Hancock County case, as Steve mentioned, with the state police and the FBI, Tom Burgoyne and a state police officer named Tommy Kirk. And we did have a lot of cooperation there. And what would happen, and what we discovered is these groups, these organized groups, and this was a group up in Hancock County, organized crime activity primarily run out of Pittsburgh. Kelly Manarino was the Jojo Pecora. Those were the characters who run that place. And they had been active up in Chester on what was called the Strip several years earlier, and that was a casino's operation, and that was all busted up. And what happened when Sheriff Ron Donnell was elected, one of these gangsters came to him and said, you can make a lot of money if you let us get involved with the machines. And Ron went to the FBI, and we started an undercover operation. And we got involved into, at that time, public corruption, bribery, prosecutor was involved, several attorneys, gambling, extortion, those kind of things. And we were looking at this, and we said, how do we prosecute these kind of cases? Normally you would have to have a separate charge for extortion, separate charge for bribery, separate charge for gambling. And at that time, we discovered what was the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organization, RICO statute, which has gotten a lot of publicity recently with some of the national prosecutions. And under RICO, if you have an organization can be any type of entity. And if that organization commits separate crimes, you could put that all in one charge. Then you have a RICO conspiracy. And there hadn't been a lot of RICO prosecutions nationally. And in fact, the first national RICO prosecution out in San Francisco involved a motorcycle gang and was not successful. So we put this RICO case together, and we were very successful. I think we had about 12 trials in that case. I don't know how many people we indicted. It was the lead was Robert Altamar, who was the prosecutor. There were Jojo Pecora was involved in that thing, the organized crime game from Pittsburgh. And so we had a tool, a prosecution tool, where we could put these various crimes together, which we knew these organizations were involved in. So what we did is we start looking in the Northern District of West Virginia and seeing that there were a lot of these types of organized crime organizations that committed all of these different types of crimes. And we said, okay, well, how are we going to investigate these things? Because the state police has one jurisdiction, FBI has IRS has another, and nobody at that time wanted to work with the IRS from a criminal standpoint. Because they said the IRS is too slow, there's all this paperwork, which is very tedious, it's not very exciting and stuff like that. And so how do we put all this together? Well, we had an IRS supervisor come in from San Francisco named Jimmy Cannell. And Jimmy said in San Francisco they were using a tool called an investigative grand jury. Now, grand juries always existed in the federal system, and what you would normally do if you wanted to charge somebody, you would have to present the case to the grand jury, and the grand jury would if they approve, would issue an indictment. It would be a robbery case, bank robbery case, those kind of things, maybe some drug cases. And that's how, and the agent would usually provide the testimony. Or like in the case of Hancock County, we had Ron Donnell testify. You'd have an undercover operation and stuff like that. But then, we want to say, we follow the money. You've heard that before. So let's bring the IRS into this thing. Let's combine all these different agencies. Use the grand jury. We can issue subpoenas. We can get documents. We can present witnesses to the grand jury. And it's called an investigative grand jury. So we formed this task force in Parkersburg and started to look at very different other areas. The first effort we had a murder case, and we thought it was connected to organized crime up here in Wheeling. And we started an investigation, and unfortunately, we were not very successful in that case. But then, in investigating that case, we discovered a large marijuana operation in West Virginia run by a bunch of moonshiners out of North Carolina. So we have this concept with the investigative jury, the grand jury, the IRS, all the other agencies, including local agencies, state police, and it works. And we have RICO. So you put all this together, and you have a very powerful tool to attack these organizations who are pretty much running free. Yeah, we've got a lot of history here about the Hankies organization, but there was an organization in Clarksburg run by Carly Gallo, which is very similar to the Hankies organization. Although it did not have as widespread geography as Hankies did. Hankies was out in the Midwest, down south with these gambling operations, Florida, places like that. So we had a core group of IRS agents, state police, FBI, some DEA, and locals, and we went from city to city. And as Steve pointed out, we were down in central West Virginia. We had Morgantown, Clarksburg, and we said, what about this guy up in Wheeling? What do you mean? The various notorious Paul No Legs Hankies. And the history of organized crime in the Wheeling area. There's two names that always come, and Ryan mentioned them, Steve mentioned them, and it's Bill Lias and Paul Hankish. Now, of course, by the time, and this is in the mid 80s, 1985, in that area, the Bill Lias reign was gone. What you had there is you still had the vintage of what happened when Paul Hankish got blown up. It was the Bill Lias that did that, and it was pretty well established that was a hit put out by Bill Lias. And then Hankish was basically a street thug. He had a criminal history of things in federal court. He had been convicted of hijacking a beer truck, some arson, and that led to his development and connection with his organized crime with the Gambino family when he was in prison. And of course, the fact that his legs were blown off, he survived that. That also gave him some status in the eyes of the organized crime people. So we brought this concept into the Wheeling area. And what we found is there was a lot of evidence and intelligence that was already out there. There were wiretaps 10, 15 years ago that the Pennsylvania State Police had. The Florida Vice Squad down in Holland, Florida, and places like that, they had information on Hankies. That's where all the mafia people from Jersey and places would go down there and hang out. The FBI, of course, had information on that. And they had the IRS. So we started gathering all this stuff together. And we would meet, the task force would meet every week and see where we were going, what we needed to do with the grand jury. And there was some bad stuff, and it's in the book. There's some bad stuff about what Hankish said. We've seen, like Ryan, we've seen the gambling, the other things that were happening, the prostitution, victimless crimes. Not really. The first thing you see in the book, as far as the gambling is concerned, was a 10-year-old girl seeing her daughter being blown away as we was performing in a gymnastic class in Wheeling. In Uniontown. How's that related to Hank? Well, that was part of their gambling operation. You will see in the book how an individual named Snooky Walls, who was very key to the gambling part of the Hankish case, was a gambling operator over in Uniontown. There was a turf dispute as to the gambling activity in Uniontown, and Melvin Pike, who was the victim of that murder, was involved in invading other people's territory. You didn't do that. If you did that, you weren't going to be around very long. That's an example of the violence that was involved with Paul Hankish. And you can see in the book, there's a history of how that gambling activity occurred, the extent of it, the amount involved. Steve mentioned going and playing a spot sheet, $2 or $3, $4, $5, something like that. That's not an example of the Hankish gaming organization run by an individual named Teddy Thesaurus. You're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars a week. It was a big, big operation. If somebody kind of cut into that, they weren't going to do that. And then the prostitution operation. The first case I tried involving prostitution was an individual named Aggie Toomer. Now, what had happened, the Justice Department had said they want organized crime drug enforcement task forces back in the 70s, and we had one in Pittsburgh. Well, the case was disbanded, and the cases involving Wheeling were sent down to our office. My first prostitution case was Agnes Toomer. She was convicted, but we didn't have, at that time, the resources to connect that up with Hankish. Again, prostitution, was that a victimless crime? Well, ask Carla DeLabra, who was the madam who was murdered up in Canton, Ohio, by Ron Asher and Ronnie Bryce. Stabbed to death by Ronnie Bryce, neck broken by Ron Asher. Does that sound like a victimless crime? No. And that's all part of the Hankish organization, part of his violent criminal history. there were the other famous landmark in Wheeling, and Ryan had some, 2244 Water Street. Steve mentioned about the 24 houses of prostitution in South Wheeling. 2244 Water Street was the kind of the base of that. And it was run by Aggie Toomer. And the reason DeLabra was murdered is she was going to be testifying in a major organized crime case in Cleveland. So not only did they eliminate the competition, they also eliminated witnesses. So it goes on. And then what else did the Hankies be involved in? Well, we had stolen property. Skinner Dorn was his source for stolen property. Skinner and his crew would go out to various places. All the places are listed in the book. The high-end department stores bring the goods back. Ron's Value Center, another place that maybe some of you have made purchases. I think Steve said he purchased his Lindsley uniforms from Ronnie Bryce. But if you did, statute of limitations only 5 years, so you don't have to worry about receiving stolen property. So you have the stolen property aspect. And then what happens? Hankies was kind of defiant. He wasn't going to admit to any of these murders or anything like that. And of course, you have the code of silence with that group. You have Jimmy Griffith, who was his hitman, Jesse Anderson, Codfish Bricker. And those were the types of guys that committed the murders and did the enforcement. And that was the first part of the trial that we had. We tried these murder cases. And Hankies, resisted that, defended very vehemently, defended very strongly against those types of things. But as you can see in the book, he was involved in several of the murders. He was at meetings involved with the planning of the murders and so on and so forth. So we're in the middle of the trial, and we start presenting the one thing which we want to bring into the picture now, drugs. In the 70s, probably early 80s, is when the drug trafficking and drug activity really increased. You went from marijuana to cocaine, and cocaine became a very popular drug. And in the course of our investigations, we found out that Paul Hankies was basically running the drug operations in the Ohio Valley area here. And we start bringing in to the grand jury these drug dealers, drug sources. They did not have a code of silence. They were very happy to provide information for us in exchange for not having to spend the rest of their life in jail. And so we got to that part of the trial and started presenting that evidence. And one of the key witnesses was an individual named Donnie Clark, who was a big source for cocaine for Paul Hankies, along with Buddy Giacovetti and people in his group. Once we got to that part of the case, it was being very embarrassing for Paul. There was testimony presented on how Paul used cocaine, how he partied with cocaine. Esquire Club was mentioned. That's another landmark institution. The Eagle Inn, and how they would do their cocaine at these various establishments. And then, Paul was really looking bad because he was a user too. And once we got to that point in the trial, we had an individual, John Ballot, who was a businessman. What Paul would do is he would ingratiate himself to a lot of people here, business people. He got Ballot hooked on cocaine, and he used Ballot a lot for his cocaine activity. And one of the more decided to collect that money. It got violent. They banged Mr. Saldell's head into the wall at his house. And the reason I want to mention that now, one of the local contractors, Paul, named B.J. Thomas, was working with Paul, and Paul took him up to Providence to repair the damage. And at the trial, B.J. testified that it looked like they were using Saldell's head for a stud finder. So that's another kind of violent act that we have. But back to the drug activity, and I think we'd been in trial probably about 6 days maybe, and I get a call on the weekend from Paul's attorney that Paul wants to work out a deal. He'll plead guilty, and for 30 years or whatever the final decision would be by the judge. And we said, fine, we'll take a look at it. Came in Monday, and it was right after Donnie Clark had testified. And I think Paul had enough of the testimony of the drug activity. Also, part of this reason for pleading was that he wanted to protect his wife, Patty. She was named as a defendant in the case, and everybody else had pled out except Patty. Patty proceeded to the end of the trial, and she was found not guilty. So that's how the trial ended, and of course, Paul ends up getting his 33 years, died in prison several years later. Now, we leave some extra time here for any questions.
Mr. Kolovac, we'll answer your questions if you have some, a little bit of Q&A before we break up for the day. I know that this is usually an hour, so before Bill gave away the whole book, I wanted to come up and go ahead and give you an opportunity to ask whatever questions you may have. So I see the gentleman right there. Please ask. In my research, it wasn't rumor. The generosity was there. But what Big Bill did was when they hijacked the truck, he gave away some of the stuff. So he's taking, the whole rob Peter to give to Paul kind of thing. There are stories out there that I've researched that colored TVs to a family that didn't have one, turkeys at Thanksgiving, free admission to Wheeling Downs. One thing neither of us mentioned was Wheeling Downs was Bill Lias's racetrack at one time until the IRS came and took it away for non-payment, non-tax payment. Then they hired Bill Lias to be one of the most expensive federal employees in the country to run it. So, and I've noticed that, I said earlier, a lot of people have fond memories of Big Bill Lias. They even had Big Bill Lias Day, but he was a gangster. He bombed businesses. He bombed homes. And as Bill said, he was the favorite to have put the 7 sticks of dynamite on the engine block on Richland Avenue in Warwood, West Virginia. It was real business, and that's the way they treated it when we were talking about organized crime. Yeah, there's a lot of those kind of stories on Big Bill because he was a giver, but he was most definitely a taker too.
I have a comment and a question. I think that we really should have a museum like the one in Savannah, Georgia. It is a prohibition museum, and it's got all kinds of things in it, like the lives period. So my question is, was there a attorney named Joseph Maria that had anything to do with Hamish?
I'm sorry, one more time?
Joseph
Joseph Florida.
an attorney. I think he might have been from Morgantown or something.
I think you're talking about when Loretta was, there was a attempt on him, and that was in Morgantown, and that was not related to any organized crime activity we were able to determine. It was a domestic matter, the ex-boyfriend, some things like that, as far as the information we had.
Go ahead, Kim. Yes.
Was it?
Okay, so anybody that knows my family knows that my father worked for Bory Incorporated for 36 years. I was the big boy in the costume. And I do remember when I was a child, and I've told Bill and several other people these stories. When I was a kid, my mom was famous for the saying, Eddie, take this one with you. I was that one. So my dad would take me to work on Saturdays because my dad was one of the comptrollers, which means the CPA back in the day. And he would come up to me, he'd give me some odd job, and he'd come to me and say, hey, Uncle George wants to see you down in his office. So I would go down, he'd hand me a couple of envelopes, and I would deliver them where they needed delivered in downtown Wheeling. I was a courier. Didn't really know it, but the crisp 20s spent the same. I met Paul Hankish pretty regularly when I would do that at the 12th Street Grill, the Cork and Bottle. So yes, there was a lot of gambling associated with the Borys. Not necessarily Mike or Ellis. It was mainly George Bory that was a bettor, very interested in a lot of athletics. Used to see us come play baseball at Lindsley when I was a kid. He was a sports fan, and he bet on it. Some of the extracurricular activities, there were obviously some of that, but one of the things that this guy, I said, Bill, when we first started working together, I said, Bill, I got to ask you a question. And he goes, what? And I said, there's rumors, right? There's always the rumors. I said, was there ever a boat in the ocean between Florida and Cuba that George Bory owned and got busted by the federal government? We've all heard that rumor, right? Bill Calabash gives me the answer. No. I'll let him explain.
Well, I have a George Bory story too, and it relates to our investigation of Joe Trulio, which is the prostitution case that we prosecuted that's described in the book. But Mr. Trulio also ran a exotic attire store down in Wheeling next to the McClure Hotel, and he also had a gambling operation, and that he ran out of there. And when somebody would place a bet, they would call in and there was a tape on the phone, and Trulio would tape that. Well, when we raided the King of the Road Health Club and the exotic tour store, we seized those tapes. And on one of those tapes, there's a caller calling in. He wasn't placing a bet, but he was looking for some services of some of Joe's employees. So and it was a prominent Wheeling businessman. And so we indicted Mr. Trulio for a wiretap, and his attorney came up and said, are you going to play, or the businessman's attorney came up and said, are you going to play that tape? And I said, yeah, we have to play that tape because we can't prove the case without it. And that individual Trulio was convicted of prostitution and eventually then pled guilty to the wiretap, so we didn't go to trial. But you can guess who the businessman was in that particular situation, looking for services for some of Trulio's employees.
Just another piece of history connected to Joseph Trulio. Ryan was like, hey, does anybody know where Jill's is? Up in Dallas Pike, there used to be the Lucky Lady Lounge, very popular establishment. And I just wrote about this too, with Joseph Trulio's son, Joey Jr. There's one of the children of the mob. There was another establishment up across the street from the truck stop called the King of the Road Health Spa. And it was completely separate from the Hankish operations. Bill doesn't know if there was a deal between the two men, but it was, and it was present for a long time until this guy caught wind of it, because it was strangers meeting strangers. The females would come in from South Carolina, Virginia, along the East Coast, and of course the customers would be the transient truck drivers. The only people that knew each other was Trulio, his madam, and two other individuals that this guy indicted as well. That was the first local case because that indictment came down in the trial, very quick trial, in 1982. So that was the beginning of the fall of organized crime here locally when this guy and his staff indicted Joseph Trulio and sent him to prison.
In regard to Jill's, we did take a look at Jill's and we did execute a search warrant out there. And I actually went on that search warrant with the state police and the IRS. And there was a state police officer named Big Bob Cunningham. And Big Bob was about 6'5", 240, and he was my kind of protector on these raids. And Big Bob went in and broke the door down, and so we had agents inside. And then the IRS agent comes up when we're having the raid, and he gets up on the stage with a microphone, says this is a raid. The dancer did not stop. So here's Donnie Benninger up there saying, and it made a lot of noise coming in. And here's Don Benninger up here collecting dollar bills on behalf of the dancer. So there are some interesting facts with some of these investigations.
Go ahead, Ryan. Okay, so the daughter is Rose, and then there was Christopher Paul, and then there was Peter. Christopher Paul did die in 2011 in an area of Pittsburgh in South Hills called Birdland, or St. Clair Heights. On that day, when Christopher Paul passed away, he was to go to federal prison. Rose lived in years and years up in New York, stayed out of it. If anybody is a member of the Greek Orthodox Church locally, you have seen the memorials in the missalettes or pamphlets at the services. But yeah, that was unfortunate with Christopher Paul very much. One of the chapters that I did write was called Betty and a Bomb. It was the first chapter of this new series. And it's the lady that lived 3 doors down, and she babysat those children. And she remembers one day, and this is in that chapter, she remembered babysitting and another girl helping and everything, and they were inside the house on Richland Avenue. And 2 gentlemen came into the house, sat down at the dinner table, or the dining room table, and they were talking business. All of a sudden, they took off their jackets, and there were the holsters with the pistols. And after about 20 more minutes of that meeting, those holsters came off for comfort, and they were put down on the table, and that's when those babysitter girls took the kids back outside. Anybody else? Yes.
I actually worked with George Floyd as well, and I ran all of the stuff. And on Monday, George would come in, and he'd say, "Now, Judy, make the local people first." He said, "I didn't do well in the meetings, but then
That's a true story, ladies and gentlemen. That's a very true story. George had a lot of hidey holes in his house, too, on Hawthorne Court, where a lot of those things were hidden. I don't want anybody to get the wrong impression of George. He had vices just like we all do. They were just a little bit more available, and it made the news quite frequently thanks to this guy because of what those vices involved and where you had to go to get it.
When not only I would go to Miami on business, she would bring back boxes of mittens, and I was concerned about mittens, and she said, "Oh, we just put the cocaine in the fingers of the mittens in order to get them from Mexico to Miami."
Any proof of that, Mr. Calabash?
What's that? I didn't.
Just the smuggling of the cocaine. See, there was another rumor about Deep Finch Forest that's not true either. There were a lot of talk. There was a lot of talk around town, right, Bill, that was true and some wasn't necessarily true.
Yeah, that's correct. I think if you read through the book, you'll see the actual facts that were there. And part of the reason we wrote this book and some of the articles of Steve is to dispel some of those rumors that were going around that had some effect on the reputations of some of the people in Wheeling who really were not involved in this type of activity.
Yeah.
Every time a grand jury would be convened, I would get a call, not only here but in other districts, if there was somebody prominent who was very successful business-wise, legitimately, when are you going to indict this person? Or they did this, this, and this. And none of that was accurate. And I think a lot of it was put out by people who were jealous of the success of these individuals or had some sort of other agenda. And so we were able to dispel a lot of those rumors.
This young lady over here is standing there because we're done. So thank you, everybody, for coming.
If anybody wants to sign books.